Good morning, everyone. I'd like to bring to order the Northern Shrimp Section meeting. I know I am not Richie White. Our chair could not be here today. I am Tony Kearns. I'm the director of the Fisheries program at the Commission, and I am filling in. Our vice chair also could not be here in person today. So I think we have an agenda before us. And I want to see if there are any changes to the agenda. Seeing no changes to the agenda, it'll stand approved. Before we get into the business of the agenda, I just wanted to recognize Maggie for all of her extremely wonderful, long, tireless work that she has done on the for the Commission on the Northern Shrimp TC and other work. It's Maggie's retiring, I think, at the end of this month. Megan will add how many years you've been with Maine, because I'm not 100% sure. But you have served on the Northern Shrimp Technical Committee for over 2 decades. You've chaired the TC, the Stock Assessment Committee. Your valuable knowledge of the fishery and northern shrimp biology was invaluable to us as we evolved the shrimp stock assessment itself, from the initial simple catch at age analysis and surplus production models to the most recent sophisticated statistical catch at length model that we developed in collaboration with the University of Maine. You have coordinated Maine's participation and provided technical input for the summer shrimp survey regarding survey strata, station selections, as well as exploring options to run the survey on an industry vessel. And have been invaluable in maintaining this 40-year survey time series that was the envy of many stock assessments over time. Your contribution has led to significant progress with all things shrimp, while providing excellent scientific, organizational, and outreach activities for all of the things that we've done here with shrimp. I know for myself, when I have filled in as the species coordinator for shrimp, you have been so helpful to me in helping me understand where we were in the process, what information we needed to gather, in particular when we were doing the sampling through the commercial industry in the winter months. And so thank you so much, Maggie, for all you've done for us. I know Megan's going to say a couple words and then I have one more bit.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry, Maggie, my back is to you here. This is a weird position, but I also wanted to pass along thanks from Maine DMR for all that you have done over the years. You've really been at the helm of shrimp and held that position for so long, and it's going to be a big loss to not have you at DMR anymore. I think one of your greatest attributes that I see is that you've just been a really effective and trusted communicator. You've developed long-standing relationships with section members, with the TC members, those who work on the stock assessment, and those relationships have been really invaluable. And I think that speaks to your character about maintaining and growing those relationships. And I also know that you've reached out to many folks from DMR who have retired over the years. So you've been able to maintain those relationships even as people kind of come in and out of the department. And I think that speaks volumes. So I wanted to thank you for all of that. And just for some few fun facts about Maggie that you may not know as section members, she holds additional positions at DMR, and some of the ones that maybe are, I'll say, the most thankless positions to hold, but also the most important. She works on our website, she helps with communication, and probably most importantly, she also has been the head of our MASICA program at DMR for several years. And MASICA is a program that we do at the end of the year each year, where the different departments in the state government donate to different charities, and it's a competition between the different departments of who can raise the most money. It is really hard to ask people to donate and to do that with kindness, but determination, and Maggie has been great at that. So I wanted to thank you for all your work on that project as well.
Maggie, I have for you a Compass Rose pin. This is a pin that was designed to honor individual contributions to the commission. It's based on the Compass Rose, which is an ancient figure that displays the orientation of the true cardinal directions. And like the points of the Compass Rose, you have helped to guide the commission in setting its priorities and achieving its goals. So thank you so much, Maggie. And then Dennis, if you had something you wanted to add, I'll give this to you.
Yes, thank you. Congratulations on your retirement, Maggie. I'd just like to say that I've had dealings with you throughout the years in shrimp management. I've emailed you, I've talked to you on the telephone, and I've always found that you were responsive to me and provided me good information. And I always appreciated and recognize the good work that you've done with Northern Shrimp. So I hope you enjoy your retirement. Thank you.
So in 2000, when I started on the TC, I think Mike Armstrong was the chair. And but I think Dan Schick had been the year before, so you can blame him. Luckily, Dan, who worked for DMR, if you don't know, he was our shrimp person before me, continued to go to meetings and ride with me in the car, and I would try to pick his brain because I was just terrified because the next year I became chair. But it's been a wonderful relationship for me with this group. The TC has always been congenial and respectful, and so has the section, and I've really appreciated that. The relationships, frankly, were very easy because it was such a great group to work with. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Maggie. All right, and we're gonna get into business. And just so everybody is aware, it's one microphone per state. Just turn it on when you start talking. They can all stay on, but then, then you'll be mic'd when you're whispering to each other. So we're gonna start the meeting off with Dustin's just gonna give us a quick overview of how we got to where we are today before we move into the TC's report on potential effects of eliminating the summer survey. So.
Thank you, Tony. As Tony said, I'm going to start by providing an overview of why the section has gathered here today and provide some background information before handing it over to Katie Drew, who will get into the TC presentation. So the northern shrimp stock collapsed in 2013 and has been in a fishing moratorium since 2014. At the section's last meeting in December 2021, the section determined that the fishing moratorium would be extended through 2024. Given the continued poor condition of the resource, the extremely low likelihood of being able to fish sustainably, and the value of maximizing spawning potential to rebuild the stock if environmental conditions should improve, the section determined that continuing that moratorium was the best course of action. Next slide. At the same meeting, the section discussed several analyses that should be completed to continue evaluating different management strategies to assign a management regime appropriate for the northern shrimp stock, taking into consideration biological status, its historical cultural value, and its remaining economic value. The section tasked the Northern Shrimp Work Group with 3 items. First, the section tasked the work group with developing a contingency plan in the event funding for the summer survey was lost. Second, the work group was asked to outline steps and ramifications of the commission relinquishing authority of the Northern Shrimp FMP. And then last, the work group was tasked with further developing a personal use fishery management program. The work group has met twice in the spring and has made progress on items 1, 2, and much work still remains on 3, but I'll get to that in a second. Next slide. So to provide a little background on bullet 1, the summer shrimp survey has actually not been funded by the Commission for several years now. The survey is funded by the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, and for several years, continued funding for the summer survey has been under question. But the Commission was recently informed that 2022 could very well be the last year of funding. And with the loss of such crucial data, the section was interested to learn how the survey could be replaced or how management for northern shrimp could continue without it. The work group asked the TC several technical questions to better assist the section in understanding the situation. So Katie will take the lead on this presentation and will present on TC questions and answers. She will also present an analysis of the potential effects of eliminating the summer survey. And after a presentation, we can break to allow for some opportunity to comment or ask questions on what has been presented. After that, I'll present on issue 2. The section will outline the work group's proposed process for the Commission relinquishing authority of the Northern Shrimp FMP, followed by implications in state and federal waters, and a list of pros and cons for all the different ramifications if the section decides to continue down this path. In regard to bullet 3, the work group thought that section should first make a decision on whether to recommend that the Commission relinquish authority over the FMP. And if that does come to pass, the work group thought that each state could develop their own management program for a personal use fishery. If the section decides that the Commission should retain authority of the FMP, then the work group could proceed with further developing a personal use fishery management program. Next slide. So in essence, this is the meeting's purpose. First, provide an information update on work group and TC progress, in particular relating to the potential loss of the summer survey funding. And then we should be talking or discussing what remaining steps should be taken before the section considers whether to forward a recommendation that the Commission relinquish authority over the Northern Shrimp FMP. With that, I'll turn it over to Katie Drew.
So this is going to cover some of the TC responses to the work group's specific questions. In particular, the work group had several questions about if the summer survey is retired, what other metrics can be used to provide information for stock assessments, and how would that impact the current model that we're using, and as well as the projections. Also questions about the summer survey's ability to capture recruitment, that 1.5-year-old age class, and whether other surveys could replace some of that information. And if we do adopt if we need to do a new survey, how can we best bridge that gap from the assessment standpoint to make sure that we have the best time series available. So the TC met several times to discuss these questions, as well as providing several analyses regarding the effect on the model to answer some of these questions. So first of all, to the first question, if the summer survey is retired, what other metrics can be used to inform the stock assessment? So first of all, we do have obviously 2 other surveys in this region, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center Bottom Trawl Survey and the Maine, New Hampshire Inshore Survey. The TC did discuss the potential for looking at winter commercial sampling data, but does not recommend relying on that as a source of information about the stock, given especially as the scale of the fishery shrinks and becomes very tiny. Those individual samples you're getting from a very small fishery is not really representative of the full population. So we do not recommend relying on any kind of winter sampling from a very small scale fishery. However, we do have these 2 other surveys. There's pros and cons to both. The Northeast Fisheries fall bottom trawl survey. Obviously, the funding is not in doubt for that survey, as far as we know. So that's a long time series. It's very important to a number of stock assessments, so it's probably going to continue into the future. And it does capture northern shrimp. The downside is that the fall survey data are usually not available in time to inform management. So we would be a year behind, or would have to really delay decisions on a winter fishery in order to have that data. So it's kind of there's a lag there that makes it not great for the way this fishery is managed or has been managed in the past. The main New Hampshire inshore trawl survey operates in a slightly different area, and it does capture northern shrimp as well. There are some questions about funding for this survey as well into the future, although that's very nebulous. And I think there's also concerns about whether this is able to, how much this survey is influenced by the migration of shrimp on and offshore. So these two surveys do provide information on northern shrimp, but they don't provide the level of detail and the quality of information that come out of that summer survey. So the next question that the section was interested in is, how will the assessment model performance be impacted without that summer survey data? So the TC conducted sensitivity runs of the UME model. That's what we call our statistical catch at length model that we currently use to assess northern shrimp, to evaluate the effects of losing that summer survey. Obviously, before I get into these results, just want to preface this by saying we really would need a full management strategy evaluation to really answer this question. It's kind of hard to, we would need to really project this into the future to be able to say, you know, what's the probability of incorrectly assigning a stock status, et cetera. So we can do some sensitivity runs, which is basically dropping off a few years of data and seeing what happens. But the further back in time you go, you're sort of losing the benefit of that long time series. And so it's hard to say exactly what the long-term effects of not having this survey are going to be, but we can definitely look at some of the potential short-term effects. But to really answer this question, we'd need a more complicated analysis that we just didn't have time for. So we did a series of runs, basically starting with a set where the terminal year was 2021, and then so basically having the base case of all the data available, and then doing runs where, number one, we added in the Maine New Hampshire survey. We generally don't use this survey in the base case, just because of some of the other data issues that we discussed, because we do have the good quality data from the summer survey and the fall bottom trawl. We generally don't use this in the base case. So we added it back in as a potential source of data going forward. And then we started shortening that summer time series. So basically removing 2018 through 2021 from the summer survey time series, and including all years of the bottom trawl survey, and then adding in the Maine New Hampshire, but without those last 3 years. And then one run where we dropped the summer survey altogether and just used the Maine New Hampshire and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center trawl survey. So the point of this is to kind of say, you know, if we were missing these most recent few years of data from the summer survey, what would have been the effect on the stock assessment compared to what we actually saw? So we also did a set of runs where we looked at the terminal year of 2011, and we picked this year because this was a year of sort of conflicting information in the time series. So this graph shows all of the surveys together. So we have the summer survey in black, the albatross years of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in yellow, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center fall Bigelow years in blue, and the Maine New Hampshire in this sort of greenish color. And so you can see at the end of the time series, they all line up really well, everybody's agreeing. But there's sort of this period where the Maine New Hampshire spring inshore survey continued to increase while the other surveys were decreasing. And so we wanted to look at what happens if you have a period where these two surveys don't line up or don't always agree on the trend. And so we used a terminal year of 2011, which would basically cut off this blue box of data. And so we did a similar set where we had the base case of just ending in 2011 with all of the existing data, using the same surveys that we use in the base model, adding in the Maine, New Hampshire survey and still ending in 2011, and then cutting off a few years of that summer survey and the Maine, New Hampshire survey, but still ending in 2011. So overall, without the summer survey, the model is more optimistic about stock status in the final years of the model. So it's estimating higher recruitment, higher SSB, and a lower fishing mortality. And I'll just flip through a couple of graphs right now to show you what I'm talking about. So you can see down here the base run, which goes all the way, which includes the summer survey all the way through 2021. In black, the base run with the Maine, New Hampshire survey in kind of that orangish color, the base run without the summer survey in the blue. So that would be just the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And then the base run without the last 3 years of the summer survey and with the Maine, New Hampshire survey in kind of this greenish color. So keeping in mind that if we don't have the Maine, New Hampshire survey in there, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center data does actually end in 2019 for this run because it did not occur in 2020. And when we did these runs, the way we would do it for a 2022 assessment or a 2022 fishing year, we would not have that 2021 data. So what you can see is, so this is recruitment. You can see with the summer survey years, recruitment is much lower in the last few years than without it. Similarly, here's spawning stock biomass, that once you drop those summer survey years, the population starts to go back up again at the end of the time series. And similarly, without the summer survey, you have lower estimates of fishing mortality, although this is obviously very tiny at the end of the time series. So the model is more optimistic about what's happening compared to the model that uses the summer survey and the best available information. It did not really change our perception of stock status in the sense that you can see, so this is the run without the last few years of the summer survey and sort of but with the Maine, New Hampshire data. So this is essentially the run that we would be using if the summer survey stopped. And you can see it is ticking up higher in terms of SSB at the end, but it's still well below the time series median and even the 20th percentile of the time series. So it's not like dropping it says everything's great. It's better for sure, but it's still, not great compared to where we were historically. So it doesn't really change our perception of stock status that much. It does have a little bit of an effect on the short-term projections. So you can see the top is the base case, and this is saying, under a few low F scenarios, what's the probability of being above SSB 2021? And the answer is extremely minimal in all of these situations. When we drop the last few years of the summer survey, the model is more optimistic about, hey, you're going to be okay in the first few years. But then as we pull in more of that recent natural mortality and recent recruitment data, the probability drops off after that. So it's a little more optimistic in the first few years because you're just starting out in a better place than you did with the full data set. So looking at the terminal year, I won't go through the same type of figures for this. I just wanted to point out that the model did struggle to converge somewhat if the terminal year was 2011. So similarly, the answers were, when they did converge, similar to the full-time series runs where not having that summer survey data made the model more optimistic about where we were. So this indicates that conflicting data trends in the future may cause problems with convergence in the model or may require a delay in the assessment timeline in order to get the Northeast Fisheries Science Center bottom trawl data in there as well to allow the model to converge. So and I guess just to back up 1 second, I guess the overall sort of conclusion about this is that on a course scale, dropping those few years of data from the summer survey isn't having, a huge effect. We're still depleted. We're still well below where we were. Historically, the stock is still not in a great spot, but the model is more optimistic about where we are compared to having the full time series. And so depending on how these data are going to be used, that could have implications for management and the risk of management actions on this stock going forward. So especially as you if the stock were to recover or to appear to recover in some of these other surveys, you run the risk of being too aggressive with your management and not conservative enough relative to what the actual status of the stock is. So on the other hand, if this is, the condition of the stock continues to persist at very low levels, the Maine, New Hampshire survey and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center survey have been picking up those same trends. So it's likely that if the low conditions of the stock persist, our perception of the stock status won't be qualitatively that much different from including the summer survey. So the next set of questions was about the recruitment data. So where can we get additional information on that 1.5-year recruitment trends? So the Maine, New Hampshire survey and the fall bottom trial do capture those recruits, the 1.5-year-olds, although not as effectively or informatively. And again, the fall data won't be available until the following year, just based on the timing of when these surveys happen and when our assessment happens. So the last question was new surveys. If we do adopt new surveys or data for use in the future, how can we bridge that gap from a continuity run perspective? So if the summer survey stops, but we want to bring back something similar in the future, what can we do about that? So obviously there's a couple of different options. That side-by-side calibration can immediately extend the time series, but that's obviously very resource intensive. So, if we could bring back the Gloria Michelle for a few calibration toes, et cetera, and then start this new survey, that would be, we could deliberately immediately extend that timeline, but again, resource intensive. Statistical modeling can be attempted. The VAST approach has been used in a number of assessments, and there's a growing body of research about how to statistically combine surveys that happen in a similar area but don't necessarily overlap temporally. There's no guarantee that that would actually work. There may not be enough information to do that. So otherwise, you would need 5 to 10 years of a new data for that survey to be informative about trends in the resource. So trying to restart this up, if the statistical approaches don't work, is a big time and resource investment. So that's it for the TC response to those questions. I'm happy to take questions now, and I know other members of the TC are here as well, can chime in.
Thank you, Dr. Drew. Does anybody from the section have any questions? And I can also go to the webinar to see if any of the members of the public have questions. David Waters.
Senator Waters, New Hampshire. And so the questions I have relate to whether or not it is possible to sustain management if we don't have certain kinds of data. And, it seems to me that the question becomes, kind of twofold. If you have this gap potentially, so does it essentially mean, although I know you have the VAST model there, that you really cannot, that you're kind of in a sense of abandoning the long-term data that we have. So then the question is there another kind of data that can be collected that if this becomes a kind of a base period, from the time the summer survey is gone, is there something that can be kind of reliable? We're in a moratorium for a few years, but is there a way to maintain a management plan or to imagine a management plan, but based on what kind of data going forward?
I would say we can talk about it, but I will say I think there's going to be different answers depending on what happens with the stock and what happens with management. So first of all, obviously, ending the time series of the summer survey does not mean we have to throw away all that data. That data is still really informative about the population dynamics, and that informs the model, you know, up to a certain point, and that's very important for the model's understanding of what's happening. So going forward, you know, we will still have the Northeast Fisheries Science Center survey, we'll still have the Maine, New Hampshire survey, and so, like I said, we will have maybe I would say a coarser understanding of what the population dynamics are, and so that means that management based on that stock assessment would be riskier, and so that, you know, as you look, if we don't have that summer survey, you would get the assessment results and say, you know, if everything stays flat, then, you know, you don't see an increase, you don't see any signs that the population is recovering, you know, you can probably be confident in your assessment that a moratorium is still warranted. I think the dangerous part becomes if you start to see an increase in that population, and so how much credence or how much weight do you give that signal? And so the analysis that we did suggests that without the summer survey, you're going to be too optimistic about the size of that rebound. And so I think then management would have to think about how risky are we going to be? Do we want to, you know, would we wait to see that trend go on further? Things like that without, and I think if we then started an alternative to the summer survey, again, you would have to wait, like we said, 5 to 10 years to really have confidence in the trend that we're seeing, and that's not just noise bouncing around, and understanding sort of how that index maps onto the scale of the population.
Follow up one. So do you think that you could develop a risk model for evaluating any decisions that are made that would provide some guidance as to what margin of error based on the risk that is be involved with the kind of data sets that we have or would have?
Yeah. If you wanted the TC to do more work on this, we could set up a simulation model to say, you know, let's project the population forward and have a bunch of different scenarios of what happens if we keep the summer survey with its, you know, CV and its information. What happens if we drop the summer survey and add these other surveys, and then sort of project the population forward and say, you know, if we ran the assessment model with these simulated data sets, how would that compare to our best case understanding? You know, are you 20% too optimistic, et cetera? What happens if you base management on these kinds of thresholds or triggers? We could certainly do that. That would be a management strategy evaluation. So it's not a simple task. I'm gonna just say that for sure. I mean, I think it would be super cool and I'd be really interested in doing it, but it's also not a trivial task for the TC to work on that. But that is something that we could provide some guidance on going forward.
Megan Ware.
Couple questions, and thank you for the presentation. That was really great. In terms of the optimistic part we're seeing at the end of the time series, do you have a hypothesis as to why that's happening? Or I guess I'm trying to differentiate that between just like general uncertainty that we see at the end of a time series in an assessment.
So I think probably part of it is, I mean, it's hard to say for sure, and maybe we would have a better answer if we did that full-blown management strategy evaluation. I think part of it is just you're not, the summer survey is the only survey that happens when the population is like fully mixed in the Gulf of Maine during that summer period. Otherwise, the population does tend to sort of stratify itself a little bit based on, you know, age and sex and spawning behavior and things like that. So there's the potential that you're not seeing you're not getting a good snapshot of the population the way you are with the summer survey. And the summer survey is, of course, designed to capture shrimp. It's designed to catch those small ones as well as the bigger ones. And so you get just, I think, a better source of information on what's happening with them. And so there's, you know, possibly it is just the effect of dropping off years of data that the retrospective analysis is happening, but we're not dropping all years of data. We are keeping some of that data in there. So I think it relates to kind of what part of the population we're seeing, the detail and the precision of that data for that summer survey. And so sort of the instinct of the model is to kind of just let it roll up without additional information that comes from the summer survey.
Okay, thank you. I think my other question is, I think like another way to think about this is in the absence of the summer survey, could we detect a change in the population? And I'm wondering if that's perhaps like the more important question. And it seems like from the surveys, I thought they did a pretty good job actually of being pretty close to the base model run. So I think the answer would be yes, based on the other two surveys we have, but I just want to kind of hear your thoughts on that.
I think it would depend on the magnitude of the change. And that is something we could look at with the simulation approach of how big of a change would we need to see in order to detect a true trend. And then, you know, I'm sure we could pick up on an increase, but I think, you know, the question would be, are we picking up on the magnitude of the increase correctly? So is this just a little bump at the end, or that the other two surveys are sort of magnifying, or is this a genuine increase in the population? And I think that's something, again, we could look at with simulation work, but that really is the question.
Thank you. And then just, this is kind of like a question, but it doesn't have to be answered today, because I think part of this is what questions do we have that we would like answers to before making a decision? And I guess one question I would have probably for the Science Center is, when would they know about future funding from 2023? Like, or when would we know that 2022 is the last year of the summer survey, and how would they communicate that? Obviously, this is the northern shrimp section. We're focused on that, but there are other species that use that survey. So I think those implications could be not just at this section meeting, but at other management boards.
Thanks, Megan. I don't think we have an answer to when we would know. I think it's a little bit, I'll say, touch and go, funding dependent for that survey. But if I hear otherwise through some texting channels, whatnot, I'll let the section know. Next up, I had Dennis Abbott, and then Mike Armstrong, and then Cherie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Where are we headed with the summer survey in regards to funding? The platform of the Bigelow, is that going to be a continuation? Are we going to be looking at something else which is going to play into the accuracy of data, so on and so forth?
I don't know, and I think the Science Center is still working all of that out internally. So
For the Bigelow, Dennis, I think that has a fairly consistent funding time series, and they don't anticipate losing funding for that survey. But for the summer survey, as we said, we have been told that it is possible that we will lose funding, or that the Science Center, not we, the Science Center will lose funding for that survey in the near future. There were times when we weren't 100% sure if this summer would go off or not. So it is an unknown to us, and hence why we've been having these discussions. Mike Armstrong.
Thank you. Katie, I'm not optimistic that we will be able to do a quantitative assessment if the summer survey goes away. I can think of 100 reasons why it wouldn't work, especially since we don't have a fishery. But if we went to a simple index-based sort of thing and maybe some triggers, what could we, I guess the fall survey mainly I'm thinking about, do they catch enough shrimp to generate a reliable index? Can we backcast it to the summer survey? And what would it track? I think you mentioned it does catch 1.5-year-olds. Does it track anything else enough to create a reliable index?
the fall survey, obviously part of the problem there is that they didn't collect enough information to calibrate between the albatross and the bigelow years for this one. They do have calibration factors for other species, but we don't have one that we consider reliable for northern shrimp. So we have broken that time series back to 2009. I mean, I guess we could look into the VAST approach to see if we could extend that time series back. It does capture the older shrimp. It does seem to do a better job actually with the older shrimp compared to the younger shrimp. So we would still be looking at sort of that similar, the young males, first females, second females, et cetera. That information is available from the fall survey. We could develop an index that does seem to track the summer survey very well. So it's giving you roughly the same kind of information. I think if we went with sort of an index-based approach, using the summer survey versus using the fall survey, obviously the big hindrance is that fall survey data are not available in time for a winter fishery specification period. So we would always sort of be 1 year behind the ball on that. But it's certainly a possibility that, and then, but I think we would want, again, sort of that management strategy evaluation to figure out how that would actually work in an applied context, and what the possibility of bias or uncertainty would be, what the risk level would be of relying on an index-based approach from that fall survey. It's certainly something we could explore, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sheree Patterson.
Thank you, Katie. You've always, and Maggie too, have always explained these so well, these sort of issues. My question has to do with if the summer survey was to be conducted, say, every 2, 3, 4 years, so that in between, we understand that we're probably dealing with uncertainty without using the summer survey, more of uncertainty. Whereas if we did, sort of a ground truthing every 3 to 5 years, is that something that could be conducted and still kind of follow better the population's concerns?
Again, I'd love to pump my management strategy evaluation idea right here. But I think probably the concern that I would have is that the generation time of northern shrimp is pretty small compared to, say, longer lived finfish species. Obviously for a shrimp species, they are a geriatric population for sure. But, so if you're doing it every, we see them, they start showing up at about 1.5 years, and then they're gone by 5 or 6. So if you're only doing it every couple of years, you're sort of taking a snapshot of that one moment in time. And so maybe you'd get a sense of like potential recruitment for that 1 year. And then you're talking about, a couple of years, trying to project that fishery is really only on a couple of year classes. And so would you be getting anything better out of that than, say, consistently sampling every year on the bigelow? And I think that would be a real tough trade-off to make at this point.
Okay, I do have a little information on how funding is put together for the summer survey. It's not a dedicated streamline of funding. It's money that they piece together to put on the survey. So it's depending on how much all the resources at the Science Center take up, if there's enough to piece together or not. I think we have talked about this before. There are other assessments that also rely on the summer survey that are important. And some of those assessments are going through what we know as benchmark assessments in 26 and 27. So I think that the Science Center is really trying to keep the survey going at least through 25. I don't think that there's promises for that, but it helps with those assessments that are going through a benchmark. And another thing that they have talked about, which we have looked at a little bit, is alternating years that you do the summer survey. Are there any other questions from the group here? Questions online, Katie?
His hand up. Okay. So I've unmuted you, Senator, if you'd like to unmute yourself. And
thank you. And am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
sorry, yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Senator Merrimont from Maine. Great questions, good answers as much as possible. The mathematicians, the insurance industries, actuarialists, they can correlate data. And can you go back for as long as there's a summer assessment with the assessments that will still be in place to find out how close they are for every year based on weather events, just anything that correlates. And while we still have data, see what percentage of accuracy we think correlates enough so we could go forward with those other surveys and no summer assessment and have some confidence about predicting, but then having a survey periodically, as someone just mentioned, to make sure that it's that they really did correlate with the changing environment. And if anybody already asked that one, I didn't hear it, but if you could answer that or maybe later answer it, something like that. Thank you very much.
Sure, thanks. Good question. So I think the issue with going back in time would be, number one, you sort of, by dropping those years of the summer survey, you are losing information about the population dynamics that we would have going forward. So we could definitely, we could go back and that's a little bit what we did here. We didn't talk about like what the proportion difference is between those estimates, et cetera. But that's a little bit what we did here. But sort of the further back in time you go, the more information you're losing and sort of the less valuable that comparison becomes. And then I think going forward, the model does look at new information that is captured by the things like the recruitment trends or changes in natural mortality that we have from outside sources. So the model is not strictly reliant on what it predicted in the past. It does have the ability to pull in new information to assess how the population dynamics are changing or are different going forward based on environmental conditions or other conditions. And so I think that's kind of where we would need that projection scenario approach to kind of look at, okay, under these conditions, under current conditions, how is the model going to perform without the summer survey? How would the model perform if things changed in the environment or if things changed with recruitment and the population itself? So I think that is something, we could do and I think does tie back to that idea of like, what is the risk of relying only on these surveys going forward, but would again require that more complex simulation approach to be more accurate than just sort of dropping off years and trying to make a relationship on what's happened in the past. Because the more years you drop off, the more valuable data you're losing from that relationship, and your ability to predict on the basis of that historical relationship goes away. So it is kind of it's hard to predict what it's going to be like in the future from the past. And so, but the more we can keep that historical data in there and project forward, the better. I'm not sure if that answers that question or not, but.
Yeah, there's always, in the question, there was always the unknown. If the similar temperature rise or acidification or anything from 20 years ago or 10 is directly correlated, and we wouldn't know that again. So opening up a fishery based on it and then proving 5 years later or whenever we could get the confirmation that we'd made a really bad mistake is certainly a possibility. So thank you.
Senator Waters.
If I could kind of follow up on the senator's question, you know, I know that there are, we kind of try to attribute what has happened to the stock to certain factors, you know, the temperature, the acidification, maybe predation. And are those effects going to accelerate or not? And I know how species specific that management has to be. However, the question is there any analog species or that might correlate that we are maintaining our data on that might give us an indication as to responding to those conditions which may be impacting the shrimp?
For northern shrimp, probably not, because northern shrimp is currently, this population in the Gulf of Maine is the southernmost population of northern shrimp in the world. So to a certain extent, they are the canary in the coal mine for this. And so it is a unique, they seem to be responding to climate change and to these predation impacts faster and more negatively than other species in the Gulf of Maine. So I'm not sure there's anything that's sort of gone down this path before.
With another question. Yeah, I suspected that was going to be the answer, but you know, based on the senator's queries. So this may be getting ahead of us a little bit, but the question was why I asked about the risk assessment earlier. Let's say, you know, we have the moratorium and we may lose the survey and we're going to attempt to see what we can do about other surveys giving us an indication. I know the question has been discussed about, you know, personal fishery and some level of catch. And do you think it would be possible to determine a do no harm level if you are in a sense flying blind or not entirely blind on some of the data assessment? Do you think it'd be possible to determine a level at which there could be some catch without potentially doing substantial damage to the stock? I mean, I saw the figure about if you think about this number of traps and so on, this number of trips, it's 9.5 metric tons. That, you know, is that a lot of shrimp? Not a lot of shrimp. But anyways, I mean, you know, as the data person, do you think it's possible to determine, you know, some kind of level that we might have some confidence in?
So we have, when we do the assessment, we usually do a set of projections of what happens to the population if F is 0 or if F is very small, based on a few other things. And the problem, I think, is that what's really driving the current status is the recruitment levels and the natural mortality levels. And so that, I think, is what we have a really hard time predicting into the future. So is the predator biomass going to go down to the degree that natural mortality will ease up? Are we correctly assessing that relationship and maybe natural mortality is not as high? Or, you know, what's going to happen with recruitment? Is recruitment going to stay in this low regime going forward? And so sort of under the assumption of low recruitment and sort of the current high natural mortality, even without any fishing pressure at all, there's almost no chance that the stock will increase above where it is now. So, and in fact, you know, would likely decrease. We could definitely provide you guys with calculations in terms of, you know, what's the probability that this level of removals would cause the stock to increase or would cause it to decrease under different scenarios. So, you know, if recruitment stays the same but natural mortality comes down, what is that sort of, you know, what's the risk level there? I think what becomes complicated beyond even the survey data question is what is going to happen in the future with environmental conditions, with predation, with recruitment, with whatever else is driving the shrimp dynamics. And that's kind of is a level of risk that we can't quantify for you.
Megan Ware. Sorry, there's a delay in the microphones.
This has kind of jogged my memory that the northern shrimp assessment has the PPI index. So I just wanted to see, is there any data going into that predator index from the summer survey, or is that all from the trawl survey?
Good question. That's all from the trawl survey. Yeah, stomach contact data and abundance data.
Dennis Abbott.
Yes, thank you. Senator Waters asked a question about a do not harm fishery. And I think we've had this discussion on numerous occasions that, especially with a depleted stock, there's no such thing as a do not harm, if my memory serves me correctly, that, Katie, that if we're catching fish, we're doing some amount of harm.
Hi, so Katie ran some projections in last fall. Oh, okay. Katie ran some projections in our assessment document last fall, you might have remembered. And as I recall, the one projection with a very low F, but not a zero F, the stock with a zero F ended up after 5 years, I think it was like 440 metric tons SSB, but with the small F, it was like 420 something. So, you know, that may or may not be a significant decline, but it was different and it was lower. So I don't think you can say that it was a do no harm fishery. And of course, there's all kinds of uncertainty around that, but it wasn't higher and it wasn't the same. It was a little bit lower. So that's out there for you to look at anyway.
Katie, are there any other hands on the webinar?
I don't see any other hands. Sorry, the senator does have his hand up, but I'm not sure if that was left over from last time. It's down now,
Okay.
so no other hands.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've exhausted our questions on the survey work. So before we move into our discussion about how we want to move forward with northern shrimp management, I will say whether or not it's something we want to start thinking about relinquishing control of the FMP or not. Dustin's going to go through an overview of the work groups discussions and taskings on this issue. Before Dustin starts into that though, just as a reminder, I think Dustin said this before, we do still have 2 more years left in the moratorium, so I don't think it's a decision that has to be made right away. You can spend some time on it or not. It's up to the section here and how you want to move forward, but we definitely do have some time. And I will continue to allow for questions as we go through each of the agenda items.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Next slide, please. So here's a quick outline of what I'll be covering in regard to the ramifications of the Commission relinquishing authority of the shrimp FMP. I'll start with the process that has been proposed. Just a reminder, this would be the first time that the Commission will have proceeded with a process like this, if that is the section's will. I'll also follow up with implications for state and federal waters. And then the work group spent some time covering pros and cons of the various consequences of the Commission potentially relinquishing the authority of the shrimp FMP. So then we can follow that up with discussion and questions. So to begin with, this section would forward a recommendation to the ISFMP Policy Board that the Commission relinquish authority of the FMP. Whether that happens today or more discussion or follow-up tasks are needed, that remains to be seen. But at some point, this recommendation would have to be made to the Policy Board. Then the Policy Board would take that up and would consider forwarding a recommendation to the Commission, the entire Commission. So the Commission would then be the final body which would consider relinquishing authority of the FMP. And if that were to pass, then states would assume regulatory authority in state waters. Next slide. In regard to implications for federal waters, NOAA Fisheries would likely draft an emergency rule to assume authority over the FMP until the New England Fishery Management Council develops an FMP. So either the New England Fishery Management Council or NOAA Fisheries would then develop a federal FMP. And the work group thought it was important to note that Section 306B of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act allows the Secretary to regulate a fishery within state boundaries if a state has taken action that substantially and adversely affects carrying out a federal FMP. This may need further research and further discussion, but it was brought up during the Northern Shrimp Work Group's discussion. Next slide, please. So then in regard to implications for state waters, I have spoken to representatives from each state to get a tentative idea of what may go into effect for each state. And I want to emphasize that what I'm sharing is preliminary and subject to change, but it might help paint a picture of potential outcomes should the commission determine that they would like to relinquish authority over the FMP. So with that in mind, Massachusetts shared that they would not pursue a trap fishery. Obviously, there is the vertical lines concern there. New Hampshire, as a reminder, does not allow trawling in state waters, and they would likely discuss with industry members about the potential of opening a trap fishery. In regard to Maine, they would discuss with industry members to see what their preferences for a fishery are. And the initial idea that was proposed at the December 2021 meeting provided a very limited season and a very limited possession limit. So they may start with that as a straw man option. Next slide. In regards to some of the ramifications of relinquishing authority of the FMP, on the plus side, states would be able to manage their fisheries independently, which provides flexibility. On the con side, it would lack consistency across states. Being able to manage the FMP coordinated across 3 states does provide some consistency and equity for users and for access of the stock. The commission would not devote staff time to the Northern Shrimp FMP, which is a plus in that it does free up staff time to work on high priority species, but there would be the con of loss of institutional management and scientific knowledge. Next slide. As I said earlier in the presentation, there is the benefit that relinquishing authority of the FMP would establish a process for the commission to follow, as this has not been done before. And there would be no need for any changes in current permitting systems and existing catch reporting systems. There is the negative, though, that the relinquishment of the FMP would result in a loss of funding to states through ACFACMA, which is estimated at $4,000 to $5,000 per year per state. And so whether this is a net gain or a net loss would really depend on how much staff, state staff time is dedicated to this fishery currently. Next slide. So this meeting was intended as a presentation of what has been considered thus far by the work group, and no final decisions need to be made today. But eventually, the section will need to consider, should the commission relinquish authority of the Northern Shrimp FMP? We've got some shrimp providing their ideas. So next slide. For discussion today, it's really important to consider what are the section's next steps? What is the preferred timeline? And then most importantly, what additional items should the work group, the technical committee, or the advisory panel be consulted on prior to the decision on whether to forward a recommendation that the commission relinquish the FMP? And I think it really ties into the discussion that was just being had moments ago regarding the survey, in terms of if we are to go down the path of maintaining the commission, retaining authority of the FMP, what does that mean in terms of further TC tasks, looking at the potential loss of the survey? And that kind of overlays if the states retain, or if the commission relinquishes authority and the states are then in control of their own FMPs, what does that mean in terms of the summer survey as well? So I think both of these topics that we've covered today really have a lot of overlap. But with that, I'll open it up for questions and really turn it over to discussion for you all.
We'll start with Dennis Abbott.
Yes, thank you. I've given this some thought. And initially, in time past, I thought it might be a good idea for us to relinquish control of management of northern shrimp. But thinking of it further, it occurs to me that relinquishing management of northern shrimp would be contrary to the purpose for which ASMFC was founded, to manage species in state waters. If I'm not wrong, if we pass, as I would put it, pass the buck to the federal authorities, either NOAA or National Marine Fisheries Service, they in turn would be obligated to formulate a management plan in federal waters and leave the states to their devices of what they would want to do. As we saw in a previous slide, Maine is already saying that they would have to consult their fishing community about which direction they wanted to go. So I would envision a state or states suddenly prosecuting a fishery on a fishery that deserves to continue having a moratorium. And I think it takes us in a negative direction. So the more I thought about it, I don't see the benefit of, as I would put it, passing the buck to the feds about this. How we go about it, the process involved in relinquishing control over species, that's entirely different. That can be figured out, should be figured out without using northern shrimp as an example, how we go to the policy board, the full commission or whatever. But again, I'll repeat that I think it's the job of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is to manage states cooperatively between the states. And if, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we would be going in the wrong direction if we allowed states to manage separately without consideration of the other states. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. And just as a reminder to everyone to make sure the mic is up close to your face. If you can't hear it in the speakers, that means I don't think the webinar can hear you. So Cherie Patterson.
So in order for the federal process to start out, it generally starts out with the New England Fisheries Management Council. And we have the executive director here with the council. And I'd like to hear what their thoughts are, and then I'll move on to my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Tom Neese. I'm Executive Director of the New England Fishery Management Council. I want to make it clear that the comments I'm going to make are ones that I coordinated with the council chair. We haven't had the full discussion with the council yet, so I'm going to try and stick to facts and not express any real opinions about what the council might or might not do. Because as you all know, sometimes it's difficult to predict what the council will do. I think the working group's explanation of the council role was generally pretty accurate. I think there are some nuances that I'd like to point out that may not be obvious to everyone. In one of the meeting summaries I read, I noticed that there was some question about whether there is an obligation for the council to draft a federal management plan. And the answer to that is yes, there is. The Magnuson Act states that the council will develop an FMP for a fishery that is in need of conservation and management. I think given the status and the history of northern shrimp right now, it would be a difficult argument to make that the fishery is not in need of conservation and management. The Magnuson Act and the guidelines are silent on when you can walk away from a species that has declined to the point where it's not even worth managing at all. And I don't know if there are any examples of doing that. There is a provision where we can have what's called an ecosystem component species, which simplifies management dramatically. In fact, I'm not sure you'd call it management, it's more data tracking. But the problem is that generally if a species is overfished, you're not allowed to turn it into an ecosystem component species. So that would be could be difficult to do. When it comes to creating an FMP, we either have to create an individual FMP or it's possible that we could add this species to an existing FMP, which practically simplifies things a little bit, but not a whole lot. If the council refuses to act, or during a time period when the council is acting and there's nothing in place, I would expect, like the working group pointed out, that the Secretary of Commerce through the regional administrator, Garfo, would probably impose some sort of emergency regulations in place. Once a stock is put in an FMP, it triggers all the MSA requirements on us. We have to identify essential fish habitat. We have to identify status determination criteria, such as, what the fishing mortality target is, et cetera, what the rebuilding targets are. And the possibility is that we would have to develop a rebuilding plan for northern shrimp. Now, I'm saying that's a possibility because the rebuilding target is supposed to be based on current conditions. And I don't know what the analysis would say right now about what the rebuilding target could be. If the stock really has no potential to rebuild, well, then we might not have to rebuild, but it would just be at a low level forever. I would point out that, and this relates to one of the issues that was pointed out as a possible pro for the commission, is that it reduces the workload of the commission on managing northern shrimp. However, I would point out that the council has no experience with managing northern shrimp. I have nobody on my staff who knows anything except perhaps how to eat them. And the bottom line is, if the council was to develop an FMP, I imagine that we would draw heavily on the states who have experience with it and try and get you to help staff our plan development teams and help provide advice on the development. The 306B issue of the Magnuson Act that was mentioned is one that's kind of interesting. It floats out there all the time and occasionally comes up with, in the instance of Atlantic herring and some other species. If you read 306B, what it says is that a state can regulate fisheries within its state waters on vessels that are registered in its state. And registered does not mean with a fishing permit, it means state vessel registration or vessel documentation with a state-owned port. And it goes on to say that the regulations are supposed to be consistent with a federal FMP, and then the language that was pointed out by the work group is, I forget, I don't have the quote, but does not have a substantial and adverse effect on achieving the objectives of the FMP or something like that. So I point that out just because, if the federal FMP, for example, continues a moratorium and says the catch is 0, then there's a question of how much state waters catch can be allowed before it starts to have an adverse effect on the FMP. And so I'm not sure it's exactly accurate to say the states are free to manage however they want in state waters, because their management has to be with the federal FMP. I know of no example on the East Coast, being right up front about this, where the secretary has stepped in and said a state is not managing consistent with a federal FMP. I know there've been conversations like that at times and there's been discussion, but I don't think that determination has actually been made. Though supposedly it's been made somewhere in the country, but don't ask me where, because I can't find the perfect example. And that determination, I think, would depend on very specific details. If the catch is 0, well, is 1,000 pounds adversely affecting the FMP, or is it 20 tons that's adversely affecting FMP? So it becomes a very fact-specific determination. The last thing I'd say is that when you talk about next steps, I would suggest that one of the next steps is you might want to have some sort of formal interaction or discussion or involvement of the council. I think it would be important to try and get a sense of how this would impact the council's workload and what the council's reaction might be and what sort of ideas the council might surface before you make a decision on relinquishment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Tom. Dennis Abbott and then Megan Ware.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Neese. That was a good explanation. A simple question. Do you think we should probably leave well enough alone?
Well, I don't know if I can really answer that, Dennis, because I got to be careful because, as I said, the council hasn't had a full discussion, and I don't want to misrepresent what the council might decide. They don't always agree with their executive director.
I appreciate your smiling answer.
Ms. Ware.
I guess two questions, and maybe one of them is for Tom, if I can ask that through you, Madam Chair. Tom, I'm trying to get a better sense of, I'll say, when the council can say thanks but no thanks to NOAA Fisheries when they ask the council to do something. So I'm thinking of, for example, recently, I think it was the monument where they asked the council to do a fishery management plan or something of that nature, and the council kind of said thanks but no thanks. And so I'm trying to understand how that example maybe is different than northern shrimp.
So I actually think the monument's a bad example. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Northeast Canyons and Seaman's Marine Monument was created, and there are no present real implementing regulations to enforce the provisions that were established by executive order of the president. And so someone has to design those regulations, and the agency came to the council and said, would you like to design the regulations? And we said, no, thank you. It was not a request for identifying a new FMP. They did not specifically identify any species that are in need of conservation and management. And our argument, honestly, is that we believe that the fisheries resources in the region are being successfully conserved in management, and the provisions of the monument really have nothing to do with management under any of our fisheries management plans. So that's why we kind of got away with it on that instance of why we refused it. You know, there's perhaps another example that might be familiar to some of you, which isn't quite the same, but it's along the same lines, and that's the management of Jonah crab. As the Jonah crab fishery expanded into federal waters, there was some discussions between the council and the commission about how we should manage Jonah crab, which is a federal waters fishery primarily, maybe entirely. And the agreement at the time, and there's a letter that the council wrote to the commission, was we recognized that the commission could move faster in creating regulations than we could. But we said in the letter that we reserve the right to consider federal management of Jonah crab in the future. Now, should the council potentially, you know, slow roll the agency and they say write an FMP and we go, sure, we'll get it done 10 years from now. The agency is actually required by the act to step in and develop an FMP in that instance. And should they not, then they're subject to possible litigation. You know, river herring shad is another potential example, but the argument there, which is a little bit weak, well, I shouldn't say it's weak. The argument there on river herring shad is that it's being successfully managed through other avenues, including state regulations and the commission. And so there's no need for another overlaying federal management plan on top of it. And so far that has been upheld by the courts, I think, on numerous occasions. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Tom. Megan, follow up?
Yes, sorry. I appreciate that. Thank you. I think that helps me kind of figure out maybe the potential pass on the council side here, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Tom. The other question I've had that I've raised a couple times is about section 306B in the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And as I have read that, one of kind of the qualifications or qualifiers for a fishery is that it's predominantly in federal waters. And I'm not sure that northern shrimp would meet that criteria. I don't think we have anyone here from NOAA to be able to answer that, but to me, that is a question that I would like answered before that. Like, I need that answer to help me make a informed decision about what to do. So that would, I think, is something that could go on the list as being helpful. And then I'll echo Tom's request for some council involvement. I think maybe a conversation with some commission, council, and NOAA leadership could be helpful just in planning out, I'll say, possible outcomes depending on the decision made. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I will keep a running list of the questions or things that we want to look at and periodically run through them for the group. Senator Waters.
Thank you. We really are in our uncharted waters in some ways with the question of relinquishment. And what gives me pause as well is that this may not be the first time, or the last time we have to consider this. If the climate continues to change or accelerates, will we be seeing other fisheries that decline to the extent that these same questions are raised? And I mean, that's the big who knows for what we're seeing in the Gulf of Maine. So it just suggests to me that we really need to, that we aren't really in a sense deciding about the relinquishment of just northern shrimp, that if we do this, we are potentially setting foundation for future decisions. So it just seems to me why this is something that that maybe we shouldn't do, or maybe should proceed or discuss in a much larger context with the council and with the ASMFC in general. Thank you.
As a reminder for process, it wouldn't be the section's decision to relinquish control. That is a decision of the full commission. It would be a discussion that we would first have with the policy board, and then the full commission would make that decision, as the full commission is the one that decides to take on FMPs, which, you know, the commission has done in recent years. So I think that while we have never relinquished an FMP before, you know, there's a similarity in taking something on and relinquishing, in one sense of gaining workload or removing workload, and the many ramifications that come along with that. And I'm not saying that in a way that it's trivial by any means. Neither one of these things are trivial when you take on a new FMP or remove one, because there are significant implications on both ends of the spectrum. Mike Armstrong.
Thank you. Okay. I really thank the working groups. I mean, I learned a lot from what they put forward, and I thank Tom. That was very insightful too. I think going into this, at least for me, I was thinking, if shrimp are all done, I mean, can we just walk away? And what I hear clearly is, sure, we can walk away, but we're ditching it in the lap of the feds in some form. And they're going to have to struggle with an FMP, with an assessment. That's just the law. So I think it's a bit disingenuous for us to do that, given what I've heard anyway. The other piece is, we need to know for sure that shrimp are done. And I suspect they are, but I also hear, you know, maybe the mid-Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation might go negative, which may stop climate change in the Gulf of Maine for a little while, maybe even cool it off. And then are we going to run back to the feds and say, can we have shrimp back again for a couple of years? So we need to make sure, yeah, I'll end at that. But on another track, I think the other piece we wanted to achieve is we keep coming back to this table with the same data and the same advice, and how long are we going to do that? And we put a lot of work on the TC and everyone else. So I think we should consider a permanent moratorium and look at some sort of indices that can trigger us coming back to the table when we hit some sort of threshold. Once we see 1.5-year-olds, I mean, I don't think we're going to jump on a big year class and hammer it. That's not what we should do. But even if we wanted to, we still have 2 years at least before they enter fishery size. So the fall index is not as troubling to me, because we do have a little time once we see the data. So I'll throw that out there. I don't, given what I've seen today and listened to, I don't think we should move forward with trying to ditch this, but I do think we should come up with a model where we are monitoring it and that's it for until some triggers are fired. I don't know if that's scientifically reasonable or, I mean, we do anything, right, in fisheries management. So it's all reasonable and doable. Is it right? I don't know. But that would be my opinion.
Thank you. Sheree Patterson. And then I'm going to go to the webinar after you're done.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. So I'm going to go in the way that Mike just went. I'm willing and understand some of the positives of maintaining the fishery management plan within the commission. I think it does help with states' decisions if there is any fishery to occur, and to have some continuity and equitability with fisheries if they were to continue within state waters. I think that turning it over to the commission, to the council, or the or to NOAA Fisheries, I agree, Mike. I think it's might be premature, might not be, but I think that if we could give the council a warning that we're going to do it in our future, and start working with them directly and have more of a seamless transition, would be helpful if we are going to give up the fishery management of northern shrimp. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Katie, are there any hands up on the webinar?
Senator Miramont has his hand up.
Okay. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. I guess my input would be to not relinquish. I also would like, if anybody starts talking about states managing, that Megan Ware weigh in on how that would work in Maine. Say, would the commission, the Department of Marine Resources, be able to override the legislature from coming in with a, well, look, everybody's saying there's lots of shrimp, we need to have a fishery, and the committee sends it along and it gets through? Would that override DMR and the scientific work they're doing, or would there be some way to keep that in check that has allowed many species to be overfished? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I think if we did not relinquish the FMP, then we would carry forward with the commission's FMP, and we would continue to act in a similar manner as we do now as a section. And how you move forward as a section is a different question. I've heard 2 suggestions of a permanent moratorium and develop an index that would indicate when you could bring the section back to the table if the stock increases enough to indicate that there could be some sort of fishing going on or a consideration of fishing. So I don't think we would have to worry about individual state regulations outside of section discussions, unless that is something that we would want to think about, but that would, I think, require a complete change in the FMP itself. So that would be a whole new direction, I think. But Megan, do you have any follow-up from that?
Tony, I think you spoke to it well. I'll comment on what was on the slides earlier about Maine communicating with fishermen and assessing our options. DMR works under a co-management system. So we speak to our fishermen about many different fishery management plans and decisions we make. So I think that bullet is reflective of our principle of co-management. I think particularly right now, it's very hard to tell what will happen given the ongoing litigation with right whales that is in a different situation than it was 6 months ago. So it's really hard for me to say what would happen. I think I need greater clarity on where that litigation is going to be able to make an informed decision there. So just to speak to what was on the slides. I guess while I have the mic, obviously I'm hearing different ideas here about moratoriums and triggers and relinquishing. I'm not prepared today to make a decision on either of those questions. I think those are pretty big questions or decisions to be making. Obviously, I've raised some remaining questions or to-dos that I think it would be helpful for me to get some feedback on before making those types of decisions. If the board or the section is going down the route of a moratorium with a trigger, I would definitely want to know more about what that trigger is, what it looks like, how sensitive it is, all those questions. So those are some of the things that I would want to know before being able to vote on something.
Dr. Armstrong, followed by Dennis Abbott.
Quick practical question. What would this look like? Would we need an amendment, an addendum, or what would we need to, I don't know, do a permanent moratorium, create a trigger and all that? I don't know if that's in our toolbox or not.
I'm going to let Dennis ask his question, and I'm going to think about that for a second. Dennis Abbott.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. To Mike's point, first of all, when we started out with a moratorium, we declared a one-year moratorium, as I recall. And then we increased it recently to a 3-year moratorium. I don't know what prevents us from enacting a longer moratorium, a 5-year or a 10-year by section action. We declared the moratoriums by section action. I don't see why we couldn't extend it. And I keep going back to this, the same question is, what is the gain of us attempting to relinquish control of management? I don't think there's a gain. So my point, if it's necessary, would be to make a motion to table this issue. I don't know for what length of time, but I think it should be tabled and further discussions. I don't even know if the value of having further discussions at this time. What we'd all like to see is we'd like to see shrimp rebound, but Mike Armstrong's been in this for a long time, more deeply than I have. And, we keep having these meetings and we see no rebound. And that's what I think prompted us to consider relinquishing control. But at that point, I didn't think that we considered the ramifications of such action. Is that not right, Mike?
No, I agree, Dennis. I mean, I was looking at it, like I said, let's just walk away. Well, we can walk away, but they can't. And it's kind of all the same pool of people, so we don't gain a lot.
I think the FMP allows us to do multi-year specs. To come back to Dr. Armstrong's question, so I think we would have to change the FMP for a permanent moratorium. I think we could do an addendum most likely to be able to do that if we wanted to. That could be something that we could look into. So I'd like to sort of focus in a little bit on some of the questions that we would want to either have the TC look into, to have the work group come back and look into a little bit more in order to decide what our next steps are. I think that I've heard around the table some folks that are uncertain to what direction they would want to go. And so I want to make sure that as we continue these discussions, to be able to answer those questions and moving forward, whether or not relinquishing is on the table or not for those discussions, I guess we can continue to move forward with that today. But Megan, I did hear that if we were to do a permanent moratorium, you would want to know what indicators would let us see when you could come back. So I think that's something that the TC could probably provide for us. I'm going to go to look at Katie and see if she gives me a head nod or non-head nod. She's giving me a kind of, so maybe I'll let her go to the microphone to see if that's something that they can look into. But Megan, if you have another question that you think she might need to answer, you can ask that too.
I think that's definitely something the TC could look into. I think we would want probably a little guidance from the section in terms of like risk and what is it like, when do you guys want to open up? Do you have to reach sort of like a specific level? Like, is it 50% more than where we are now? Or would you accept a lower level if we could stabilize lower than where we are now, but still stable? Is that something you guys are interested in? Like, I guess we would look to you to determine, because I think obviously the TC has always struggled with kind of like, we are in a new regime. What is biologically, you know, maximum sustainable yield probably is really not something we can specify in this framework. So I think we would look to the section in terms of what would you guys be willing to tolerate in terms of risk, in terms of a target biomass for this fishery, et cetera. But we could definitely then develop some indicators or you know, projections that would help us figure out how close we are to that. So I think there would be a little bit of back and forth with the section in terms of what you want, but we could come up with a set of triggers to help you identify how close you are to that target.
Ms. Ware, follow up to that, and then Shariza to follow up to Katie's. Okay, and then after that, we'll take, I've had a request for a 5-minute break, so we'll get one of those in there.
For those who sit on the lobster board, I'll just remind those folks that for the past 3 years, maybe longer, 4, I don't know, we've been talking about triggers for that species, and that conversation has been, I think, probably way more complicated and convoluted than we thought when we started that endeavor. So Katie kind of got to the point, but I actually think it's a policy decision on what that trigger is, your level of risk around it, all those things, and those can be very difficult conversations. So people are saying a permanent moratorium with a trigger. I think that's a much more difficult conversation when you get into the nitty-gritty of it than maybe it's being shared with us today. So I think those are, if that's the route this group is going, which I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I think that's actually a pretty difficult conversation. Obviously, it sounds like Massachusetts and New Hampshire are maybe more in a place of they know their decision on relinquishing than I am, and that's totally fine. But for me, I would like to get some of those questions answered so that I can make an informed decision on that one.
To follow up on that, Megan, would you want to have a discussion with the council? I know that was one of the things that we had talked about. Is that something you're looking for? I think we can figure out, have a better idea for the section exactly where we think the fishery would be conducted, because obviously we can look in the past and see where it was conducted at that, you know, in the past, but where we think shrimp are now versus the past may be different. So we would have to project that.
I think for me, learning more about Section 306B is the first step. And I don't know if there's a NOAA, you know, like policy document on that or something like that that we could look at, or have someone from NOAA present on that. But to me, that's the biggest question that still remains. And then maybe after that learning, we can see if the conversation with the Council Commission and NOAA is necessary.
Thank you, Megan. Sheree Patterson.
Katie, it would be extremely difficult, I would think, not having your experience, to come up with a viable threshold, especially if we're now going to be possibly losing the summer survey. Or, as you said, we'd be changing our parameters, but I guess that would have to go back to the TC in my mind to come up with, if we don't have effective surveys, how can we come up with viable information without huge uncertainty around it to make a determination as to where a threshold or where a trigger point is?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's feasible well, I mean, the TC can certainly try. And I think, you know, the question about uncertainty is something we'd have to run some calculations and see, you know, are the uncertainty bounds so wide on this that it would essentially encompass zero, or could we provide you with, you know, so it wouldn't, for sure, there would be increased uncertainty if we were missing the summer survey. But maybe that's a level of uncertainty that you would be willing to tolerate or perhaps incorporate in and say, you know, instead of having like a 50% chance of meeting this target, we would want a 75% chance of meeting this target in order to make sure that we're accounting for some of that uncertainty. So there are ways to incorporate that uncertainty into the management process. And again, as I said, some of this uncertainty is not quantifiable from us in terms of what is natural mortality going to look like in the future? What is recruitment going to look like in the future? I think probably one of the questions would also be that we're going to struggle with would be, is there a threshold biomass level below which the population is entirely unsustainable? And we know the stock recruitment relationship seems to have changed recently. And so I don't know if we have enough information to be able to tell you what that stock recruitment looks like in the future. So I think it would be more of a empirical target or threshold, again, related to the section's assessment of risk of, do you want to accept where we are now as sort of our baseline and then nothing that would push you below that? Would you accept a slightly lower level? Would you accept a higher level? And what would those levels look like in terms of the target that this section wants for that? And I think, you know, we can do the work and see what the uncertainty looks like. We can see what some of these questions are that we can't give you answers on, and we can give you some information that maybe would help you make a decision on a target or a threshold. But it's hard to say until we actually start working with these data, doing some of these projections, trying out some different approaches. But I guess it's not impossible is what I'm saying.
Thank you, Katie. I think I will allow us to have that 5-minute break right now, and then we'll circle back and I'll summarize the questions that I have, and we can continue to add to that list. So let's be back at 10:50. If New Hampshire could come back to the table, it would be greatly appreciated. Reel them in. Thank you. All right. So I think we can continue our discussion. I'll just put out there for this section some of the questions that I have listed here, and then we can continue to talk about what we think the section's next step should be. But some of the questions that I've heard folks want to hear answers to is, where would the fishery be conducted? Is it really federal waters or state waters? If we do put forward a permanent moratorium, what would be the trigger indicator that would bring us back to the table to have discussions? And maybe it's not the trigger that says you would allow a fishery, but it's just a trigger that would allow us to come back to the table and have discussions on a fishery itself. So maybe that's a little bit easier, maybe not. And then lastly, would be to have someone from NOAA Fisheries come talk to the group about Section 306B. And then based on that conversation, we could potentially have a conversation with the council on relinquishing shrimp or a better partnership with the council on shrimp management. Senator Waters.
Thank you. I think all discussion is good and conversations are good. But I wonder if terms of focusing our efforts in terms of those questions, that if relinquishment does seem to be off the table, then perhaps the main focus ought to be on your second issue there about what kind of, what kind of surveys, what kind of research, what kind of information the working group could come up with that would be provided to this body in terms of moving forward with decisions about moratoriums and otherwise, because if we're not going to relinquish, we don't really need to talk to the council so much. But that doesn't make the question go away about how, if we lose the summer survey, then how is it that there's going to be information provided so that in the future there can be decisions made about moratoriums or other actions as well. So that's just my kind of response to perhaps focus a little bit.
Thank you. I've just heard one section member say they weren't comfortable making that decision yet, and they were looking for a little bit more information. And I think finding out from NOAA more about Section 306B wouldn't be too heavy of a lift, because it would be someone from NOAA teaching us that. Go ahead, Ms. Ware.
The senator that there's like an order of steps here, so we don't have to be doing it all at once, but yeah, it would be helpful for me to learn more about 306B. And I think once we have that information, we can come back and decide if we relinquish or not. And then depending on that decision, I agree. That's kind of the next steps there.
Katie, do we have anyone from the webinar? Is there anyone in the room? Vincent Balzano, you can come up if you just don't mind talking into the mic.
Good morning, everyone. Name is Vincent Balzano. I'm a shrimp fisherman out of Portland. I've got a lot of things to say. I'm going to try to keep my comments kind. And the first thing I would say is please do not relinquish management of this fishery. That's number one, first and foremost. I don't think we need to go to the council and recreate the wheel and fight with the state of Maine over 306B. I'm going to go on some 10-year memory on landings, but I believe, I know it's north of 50%. I think it's more on the lines of 60% of shrimp are landed out of federal waters. That's number one. Number two, you've developed an FMP with GARE type allocations based on history. Now, I don't want to see those go away. We've already seen it twice in section meetings. Motions have been made to change those and for just a trap only fishery. And I'm a trawler. I can't support that. So I want to look into the future of this. And we need more information, not less. To go through some brief history, and Dr. Armstrong can probably tell you better than I can. It's not unprecedented to have a loss of shrimp. We went through it in the 50s. We went through it in the 70s. We had some tough times in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and they came back. It is a species that only has, what, 5 or 6 year life cycle. It's very dependent on 1 year class, and 1 year class can turn around the entire fishery. We've seen it in, I think it was 79. We saw it in 2001, 2004. And we didn't do a very good job of managing it then. We just allowed everybody and anybody to go shrimping. We all knew about climate change, and we had very few pools of cold water. And when you went fishing, you saw the CPUs hit historical highs because it was a turkey shoot. Those shrimp were fighting to get into the pools of cold water, and all you had to do was find one. So it took a newcomer to find somebody who knew what they were doing, follow them, and the shrimp were literally fighting to get there. They weren't running from us. That's why you saw those historically high CPUs of the late 2000s. So I would say maybe borrow some of the federal fishery management plans programs to get some information about this fishery. Take your limited resource, develop an RSA program, have an industry funded survey, do some environmental monitoring to answer the question, are there any shrimp left? Going for 2 weeks in July and August is not going to answer the questions of whether or not these shrimp are present. So that's what I would challenge the TC to do, is to come up with, and I've heard the word do no harm. Well, do no harm with 25, 50, or 100 metric tons. Put it out to the industry. Have them come back with a proposal on how to answer some of these questions, like we did in the past with the normboard grate, with size sorting capabilities. This is not the first time this fishery's been challenged with things. And it probably won't be the last. It may be. Maybe Dr. Armstrong's correct. The days of shrimp are over. I have a little bit of encouragement. I saw our cold winters of 14 and 15. I was really surprised we didn't see any recruitment then. All right, we had a cold winter last year. You started to see an uptick in the survey. If I understand correctly, the survey is not very good at finding the 1 and 2 year olds. They really don't. I remember in years past, it would see them, would lose them, and then they'd show up. And that was some of the disconnects. Now you can correct me on some of this. This is just memory, but please do not relinquish. And I challenge you to come up with ways to answer the question of whether or not we can still have a viable shrimp fishery. Because if we can't get enough out of it to support science, there's no way we'll ever support a fishery again. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Vincent. I will bring it back to the section. Dr. Armstrong.
You're looking for a path forward, are you?
Yes, I am.
So, yeah, we need to meet again. We have some more information, and I was particularly heartened that maybe the shrimp survey has got a couple of years of life left in it, so that'll be helpful. So I think the TC needs to bring us some stuff. Although I'm not sure the secret, we kind of got to decide first whether we're in or out. Because if we're out, who cares what the TC is doing? Because Tom will be after them next. But what I was envisioning, I don't know if this is helpful, and I was just talking to Matt, is a wake-up index. I'm not saying we need to know when the stock's recovered. I just want to know if the survey saw a significant amount of whatever, 1.5-year-olds, SSB, where it elbows us, wakes us up, we meet again, and we look and see. And it might not mean anything. It might be a one-off sort of thing. So I don't think to me, it's not, it's going to be complicated, but it's not as complicated as we think. Does that make sense? So I think to save everyone's time, we put in a moratorium and we kind of go in the background, but the TC continues to monitor and generate an index. And when it hits some trigger, we have to meet and look at the data and see if we see signs of life. But we'll have to, is that an SSB trigger? Do we want to be alerted by a strong year class? I don't know any of those things yet. And I don't know if that's helpful guidance at all, Katie.
I think we can come up with some potential triggers, but I think it's definitely something we would have to do in dialogue with the section to figure out what you want to know and what you want to meet. But I think we could, there's simple options and then there's really complex options, and we can start simple.
Sherry Patterson.
I'd like to start out simple, considering we know that the population is at the lowest of levels. So if we can have some sort of simplistic view as to when we should start paying attention to managing them more effectively from TC. While we're doing that, or while you are doing that, I'd like to hear more about how we can better monitor the population without a summer survey, let's put it that way. You know, if you guys, if the TC says we can get you to a particular understanding of where the population is, but our uncertainty levels are quite large, then what would be the next step for us to be able to evaluate, or the TC to be able to evaluate shrinking up your uncertainty levels to help with management decisions? So start out simple, move into the next step, and kind of prepare ourselves for which direction we need to go if the population does change. And I would like to maintain the FMP within the commission.
Thank you, Sherry. Just gonna check in with Katie on the webinar real quick. We don't have any hands up. So I think what I'm hearing from the group is we will need to meet again, which is, I anticipated that, and I think we will have an assessment update or index update, I guess is really what I'm going to call it, the data update this year. So I think what we could do is ask for NOAA Fisheries to either pull together a white paper, or we could hold a conference call with somebody to just give us a little bit more education on Section 306B, to provide that information. If there's any follow up on that on relinquish, then we can do that when we get the presentation on the stock index update. And then from there, we can start to task the TC with these, I like Mike's notion of the wake up index, as well as tasking the TC to give us an indication of how do we better monitor the population without a summer survey. If that does move forward, hopefully we can start to hear whether or not the Science Center will be able to pull together funding for the survey in 23, and whether or not they think they may need to be going to an every other year survey or not, and the TC can take that into consideration as they're moving forward. Katie, did you want to follow up on the index update? I think that's what we call it.
So I think we usually, in the past during the moratorium, we've done the data update, where basically we just do essentially that traffic light approach for the to present to the section for all of the data, and that should be available in November. We should be able to complete it by November. I don't know if that works with the section's timeline, but that if the section is interested in a full assessment update or any kind of projections, it would be great for us to know that now or as we go forward. But I think the traffic light approach with the most up-to-date indices, including the 2022 summer survey, should be available sometime in November.
So based on that, would that work for the group? Are there other questions that they want responses to? Megan, I do have where the fishery is conducted. I think we can get that done during this time frame as well. That should be not too difficult, hopefully.
That may be like step 2 after the 306B conversation. But
Dr. Armstrong.
So, I've lost my train of thought. So that's probably too soon for the TC to do anything in regards to indices and things like that. Because, you know, in a November meeting, we would see the traffic light and go, okay, yep, that's good. We got a moratorium, and that's a 20-minute meeting. So we could do more. And if we need to shove it off to January, February, there's no harm because we don't have a fishery. That's what I'm thinking. We make it a bigger meeting.
We can do that.
Or-
I guess it depends on if we want to have a discussion with the NOAA person on section 306B. If we did that,
Mhm.
then we could squeeze that into just a conference call moving forward. That could be intermittent
Yeah.
before or after the index update, which I'm calling it the data update.
And I think that's a quick discussion. I'll let Megan come. I mean, that's a really interesting question, but the question is whether it can be implemented on a fishery that's mostly state water. And we'd have to look at landings and all that. But I think the answer is pretty simple probably for that.
Concur. Megan, were you gonna? Oh, sorry. I thought you had your hand up. I apologize.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think a conference call is fine for learning more about 306B, and then we can come back and consider or decide, I guess, on relinquishment if people are ready at that point, and then depending on that, move forward. But I like Mike's, sorry, I like Mike's idea of maybe a meeting in early winter, beginning of the new year to make it a more substantial meeting.
Yep, we can do that. And sort of in the meantime, we may do a work group meeting with the TC if needed to give them a little bit more direction on this wake up index or additional questions on how to monitor the population without the summer survey. I think it's sometimes helpful for the TC to be able to have that interaction with the TC members. I've been told in the past anyway. And as we all said before, the moratorium is another 2 years. So the section doesn't need to meet to carry that forward for next year. So January, February is definitely a possibility for a bigger meeting. Is there anything that anybody would like to add? All right, so I think we have a path forward. I think everybody is clear. If not, please speak up now, and I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Meeting adjourned. Forgot to say that.